Okay, so what happens when one of the oldest, most traditional institutions in the world decides to crash the party of one of its most modern? I'm talking about the Vatican. Yeah, that Vatican, making its grand first ever appearance at the Venice Architecture Biennale. This is not just a story about 10 little buildings in a forest. It's a story about a century-long breakup, a totally radical artistic challenge, and a wild search for meaning in a place you would never expect.
So, how in the world did we get here? Well, here's the roadmap for today. First, we're going to unpack the dramatic, kind of messy backstory of art and faith's big divorce. Then we'll get into the Vatican's incredibly bold plan to get back in the game. We'll meet the all-star team of architects they hired, and then we're going on a little tour of their amazing creations. And finally, we'll ask the big question: what does it all really mean? Let's get into it.
All right, so to really get why this whole project is such a massive deal, we got to rewind the clock. For, most of Western history, art and faith weren't just colleagues, they were inseparable. Think of them as the ultimate creative power couple. But then, about 100 years ago, things got really messy. The artist Marc Chagall just nailed it with this quote. The Bible wasn't just a religious text. It was what one official called the Great Code of Western Culture. It was the source material, the ultimate font of inspiration for countless masterpieces. If you were a serious artist, the church was your biggest patron, and the stories of faith were your entire canvas.
But then came the Great Split. Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi called it a lacerating divorce. And that's exactly what it was. Art basically packed its bags, left the temple for the museum, and went off to chase secular modernity. It became abstract, provocative, sometimes totally self-referential, basically a private conversation a lot of people felt left out of. And faith? Well, faith got stuck. Church architecture either just kept copying old styles, more Gothic, more Baroque, or worse, it settled for what church officials themselves bluntly called ugliness in new buildings. It completely lost touch with the language of the modern world. And honestly, both sides lost something huge. Art lost this deep well of universal meaning. And faith? Well, faith forgot how to speak beautifully. So this is where it gets really interesting. How did the Vatican try to fix this broken relationship? Well, they didn't just, send a "you up" text. Nope. They decided to make a huge, public, unmistakable statement on one of the biggest stages in the entire world. They kind of started slow. They dipped their toes in the water at the Venice Art Biennale first in 2013, then again in 2015. But then, in 2018, they decided to go for the main event, their first ever pavilion at the Architecture Biennale. Now, this was a whole new level. I mean, it's one thing to hang some paintings in a rented room. It's another thing entirely to actually build. And they didn't just talk the talk. They put their money where their mouth was. The budget was 400,000 euros. Now, look, in the grand scheme of Vatican City's finances, maybe that's not a jaw-dropping number. But for a single exhibition at the Biennale, that was a serious investment. This was not a quiet hello. This was a loud and clear declaration that they were ready to get back in the game and invest in world-class contemporary design. And here is the absolute kicker. They didn't just rent a nice space and put up some architectural models. No way. Their plan was to actually build 10 separate chapels from the ground up and place them inside the secluded, beautiful forest on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. I mean, how cool is that? The entire project had this one single powerful point of inspiration: the stunning woodland chapel, built way back in 1920 by the Swedish architect Gunnar Asplund. This little building is a masterpiece. It perfectly captures this idea of a sacred space that feels like it literally grew out of the forest. It's a place for quiet, for meditation, a place you stumble upon within the labyrinth of nature. And that feeling, that became the guiding star for this whole crazy project. So the brief they gave the architects was just wild, absolutely radical. The curator himself said it was a challenge with no precedents or models. Essentially, they told these world-class designers, forget everything you know about church architecture. Forget the crosses, the steeples, all of it. Your building will be alone in a forest. It must have only two things inside: a pulpit for the word and an altar for communion. Oh, and it can't be bigger than about 750 square feet. That's it. Go nuts. It was this incredible mix of total creative freedom within a super tight, poetic set of constraints. And who did they get to tackle this challenge? Well, they basically assembled the Avengers of architecture, a global dream team. They brought in absolute titans, like Britain's Sir Norman Foster and Portugal's Pritzker Prize winner Eduardo Soto de Moura. But, and this is so important, they mixed these legends with younger, rising stars from all over the world: Paraguay, Japan, Brazil. The point wasn't to get one right answer. It was to see what 10 completely different minds from 10 different cultures would come up with. So, you have this insane brief, and this all-star team, what did they actually build? The results are, as you can imagine, absolutely stunning. So let's take a quick tour of a few of these incredible structures, just to see how wildly different the solutions to the exact same problem can be. First up, let's head down under, to Australia's Sean Godsall. He looked at the brief and immediately thought beyond Venice, beyond that one forest. He imagined a chapel for our globalized, often chaotic world. His vision was for a sanctuary that could be permanent, sure, but could also be a kind of architectural first responder, a piece of sacred space that you could pack up and send anywhere it was needed most. And his big idea was just ridiculously clever. He based the chapel's dimensions on a standard shipping container. It's just 2.4 by 2.4 meters. And why? So it can be moved by truck, by ship, by crane, and deployed again and again. I mean, just imagine this thing showing up in a refugee camp or a disaster zone or some remote community. It's a chapel designed for a world on the move. And the building itself, it's like a piece of theater. On the outside, it's wrapped in this tough, industrial-looking zinc to handle the salty Venetian air. It looks rugged, almost like a machine. This tough shell, he said, represents the endurance of the church. But then, its walls swing open like giant wings, and everything changes. The interior is revealed to be lined with this brilliant, shimmering gold, which catches the light and frames a perfect square of the sky above, forcing your gaze upward. It's this masterful contrast, a tough, practical box that literally unfolds into a moment of pure, transcendent beauty. Just wow. Okay, next up, let's jump to the host nation, Italy, and the architect Francesco Cellini. He took a completely different path. If Godsall's chapel was all about practical movement, Cellini's was this pure intellectual exercise in form and material. He was obsessed with creating something that felt impossibly light, almost like it was folded out of a single sheet of paper. Cellini said he wanted a material that would tell itself, something so unique that the material was the story. So he used these incredible, ultra-thin laminated ceramic panels. He wrapped his structure in them, creating this sharp, interlocking form of black and white planes that intersect and float past each other. The result feels almost weightless, like a piece of architectural origami just landed in the middle of the forest. It's less of a room and more of a sculpture that plays with space itself. And of course, you can't have a global architecture showcase without the superstar, Sir Norman Foster. Known for his sleek, high-tech skyscrapers, he was apparently the most enthusiastic architect of the whole group. He brought his signature focus on structural brilliance, creating a chapel that's more like a delicate skeleton than a room. It's what's called a tensegrity structure. Basically, it's made of these isolated wooden slats held in this perfect, delicate web of steel cables. Nothing is bolted together in a normal way. It's all held in perfect balance by tension. The effect is that it seems to just float above the ground, filtering light through its gaps just like the leaves on the trees all around it. It's a man-made object that beautifully mimics the logic of the forest. So, okay, we've seen these incredible, varied, beautiful designs. We get that it's cool, that it's innovative, but we have to come back to the big question. What was the point of all this? Right? Why go to all this trouble, spend all this money to build 10 abstract chapels in a forest on a tiny island? The answer is actually pretty profound, and believe it or not, it has almost nothing to do with organized religion. The organizers framed the entire experience as a pilgrimage, but not just for churchgoers. This was specifically designed as a secular pilgrimage, a path for anyone, believer, non-believer, agnostic, whatever, to take. The forest itself was a metaphor for the labyrinth of life, and each chapel was a place to stop, to get lost, and then maybe find yourself again, to experience silence, to reconnect with nature, and maybe, just maybe, reconnect with something bigger than yourself. And this whole idea connects directly to the vision of Pope Francis. He has championed this concept called the Via Pulchritudinis, which basically means the way of beauty, as a path to the divine. He argues that in our modern, messy world, beauty in all its forms, especially contemporary art and architecture, can be a new language to communicate timeless ideas about meaning and connection. This project was a bold, physical expression of that exact idea. So when you boil it all down, the Vatican Chapels project was an invitation. It was a beautiful, brave attempt to restart a conversation that had gone silent for 100 years, a dialogue between faith and art, tradition and modernity, the sacred and the secular. And this is exactly the kind of story we absolutely love to explore here. These fascinating intersections where design crashes into culture, history, and really big ideas. And stories like this, they're everywhere, just hidden in plain sight. So if you find this kind of deep dive as fascinating as I do, then trust me, the conversation is definitely not over yet.
The best way to keep this journey going is to click subscribe on the Just Necessary Design channel. That way you won't miss our next exploration into the amazing world of design. We've also put a link in the description below to some free documents and resources about the Vatican chapels, so you can go even deeper if you want. It's all there for you. So as we wrap this up, I want to leave you with one final thought. The Vatican used architecture to restart a really important conversation about faith and beauty. It really makes you wonder, what crucial conversation does the world of design need to start next? What problem out there should great design be trying to solve right now? Think about it. Thanks so much for hanging out.